talk, girl talk. What's better than girl talk? Girl talk, girl talk. What's better than girl talk? A chat with the ladies about their day, the ups and downs along the way. She's a cook, she's a chauffeur, she's a worker bee. First in the door and last to leave. Girl talk, girl talk. What's better than girl talk? Girl talk, girl talk. What's better than girl talk?
Welcome to Girl Talk. I am Carol Voisin. Regina Ayers, the co-host, our co-host, is on holiday. Girl Talk is a lively discussion of the opportunities, challenges, and successes of women in their daily lives. We interview women living in the Rogue Valley who are making a difference in our communities. Today we have a guest who many of you may know. The first time I heard her speak, I was so impressed. I asked her if she would be willing to speak to my first year SOU students. Our guest today is Susan Moen, Executive Director of the Jackson County Sexual Assault Response Team. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
Would you say a few words about who you are? Maybe a little different from part one. This is part two.
Oh, okay. Well,
if you can, or repeat some, that's fine.
You know, I've lived here in Ashland since 2000. I moved up here from Los Angeles. Had a whole other career in the film and television before I
What did you do in film and television?
I was an assistant director.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then while I was doing that, I trained to become an advocate and worked in Los Angeles as an advocate, and then moved up here and wanted to continue that work, and so we created a nonprofit.
So you actually created it?
With other folks, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we have great partners. Community Works provides advocacy. We provide sexual assault nurse examiners to do acute response, and it's really a community effort. The law enforcement, district attorneys, we're all members of the sexual assault response team.
Very good. So this is part two of #MeToo.
Yeah.
And this section, what we're going to focus in on is SART, your organization,
Okay.
and what is happening locally to deal with sexual assault and harassment. So, Susan, give us some ideas of what is actually happening in our community right now.
Sure. So for years and years, the focus on sexual assault response teams and things were responding after the fact, responding to survivors, to victims, providing support for them and helping them with whatever they needed. And after a while, you do enough of that and you really want to make a difference in prevention. And so we have started with our community partners, we've started really focusing on how do we turn to prevention and how do we create a society where the acceptable level of tolerance really for gender violence is different. Because right now, we know these statistics, we talked about them in the first part, 25% of women and depending on age, 3 and 15% of men experience sexual assault during their lifetime. That's huge numbers, and yet as a society, we sort of go, okay, that's just the way it is, and so what we need to do is say that is not acceptable. When we're in classes with kids, one of the things I'll say is, if 25% of the kids that rode the school bus to school were injured by riding the school bus, would we have figured out how to make school buses safer? Yes, we would have, right? And yet we're saying that the acceptable level of gender violence in our society is 25% of our female, and men as well, and LGBTQ population heavily victimized. So we need to do something about it. And one of the things that Me Too did is showed in this incredible, overwhelming wave, really gave faces and names to all of those percentages that were just percentages, right? They were just numbers, and now they're people.
Now we have faces and names.
Yeah, and how do we turn that? Because I think there is some outrage now, luckily, and there is some questioning, and there is some what can I do? And so that is what we're looking at. And one of the first places that we wanted to work with is with kids. We need to create an entire culture change where this is not acceptable. And in order to do that, you need to start early and often.
Okay. A question I have as you were speaking was this, and since you're working on prevention, which I think is extremely important, how do you measure success when you're trying to prevent it? How do you measure that? How do you know you're making a difference?
Right, and it's interesting because when we go into classes, I am not, my measure of success is not if the students can repeat back to me the things that I have told them.
Oh, good.
Right? In this issue, measure of success is, do we see behavior change? Do we see people who literally perhaps will step up and say something if they see or hear something, who will speak on behalf of a survivor who has disclosed, who might interrupt when somebody is victim blaming or telling a rape joke or some of these cultural things that make a really hostile environment, excuse me, for survivors to come forward. And then eventually, success is fewer incidents of sexual violence.
I see.
We're never going to eradicate it. People will always commit this crime. But what we do want to change is the culture that supports perpetrators, that minimizes what they're doing. We want to create a culture that understands the emotional after effects of this and understands everybody should know how to respond to a survivor when they disclose and how to help them find services. And everyone should know that this is happening, and learn how to respond appropriately to people when they do come forward. Is just one small piece of it.
I asked a millennial, one of my former students, Sid Martin, to comment on #MeToo. And I just want to read to you a paragraph she wrote and then get your response to it. She says, within my own peer group, which are millennials, they've noticed a different reaction to #MeToo. I do not mean to say this as a generalized statement, as not all individuals in my peer group do this, nor are the ones doing it only within my age range. But the overlying rhetoric with regard to the so-called Hollywood witch hunt, and she's referring to what's happened in Hollywood, obviously, are that once a person has been brought under the spotlight of having committed such an unforgivable act, anything that they have done previously is regarded as problematic and is metaphorically burned from the collective conscience of those who are supportive. So kind of going back now just a bit to the perpetrators and what happens to them. How would you respond to this comment?
Well, so there's a couple of things. The beauty of Me Too that I have seen in one way is that for a lot of people, it's not a platform. They're not saying Me Too and this is who did it. They're saying that was my experience as well. And they're adding their voice to the collective experiences of survivors as a way of both saying, look at how often this happens, right? And, also saying to folks, there are so many of us that let's have a conversation about this. So there's that. For folks who are coming forward and naming offenders who are then going through having some kind of sanctions or accountability, it is an interesting question in Hollywood where you have folks who have done maybe great work in their past. And then the question is, does the fact that they are an offender or a harasser mean that everything that they've done, I think this is what they're saying.
I do too.
Right. Everything that they've done should now be annihilated. The problem with that is that you are then saying basically that offenders are not really human in a way, right? It's putting them in this other category and saying that we can just, once we've identified them, let's just completely annihilate them. From our consciousness, right? Not look at their work again, not discuss it. The problem is that offenders are amongst us, and they are human beings.
Right.
And And they're not, and one of the dangerous stereotypes about sex offenders is that they are these horrible folks that you can look at and go, oh, that's a rapist, I need to stay away from that person. Or if somebody accuses them, they're automatically believed because that person looks like a sex offender. By acknowledging that these offenders have whole lives and maybe are brilliant, talented people as well, that makes people, I think, understand that just because somebody doesn't look like it, just because they might be a great person or a talented person, does not mean that they are incapable of this kind of crime.
Well said. Well said. Thank you for responding to that. I was curious about how you would respond to it, so thank you. Could we go to the website, SART website, and take a look at actually what Susan is doing, and would you comment on it as we watch it on the screen?
Okay, if I can see it. I think the idea is that we've got different programs. We have acute care. So we, on the website, you can learn if you have experienced a sexual assault, what is available for help. And one of our programs is immediate medical care. Within 7 days, you can go to the hospital and have free exam and find out resources. There's advocacy available 24/7 through Community Works organization. And we have support groups. So on the website, you can find those services or resources that a survivor might need. And also a place where people who are well trained in advocacy can provide help to you. The other thing that we look at is the prevention piece. What are we doing around prevention? And here in this county, we are responding to a state mandate called Aaron's Law by providing sex abuse prevention classes kindergarten through 12th grade. So there's a Senate bill that was passed several years ago that said we need to address this. We need to engage in prevention and not just response. And so there's a mandate that we provide this education in schools starting in kindergarten. And here in Jackson County, we've created that curriculum. I have a phenomenal preventionist named Kendra Laffrey who has created a curriculum kindergarten through 12th grade that we bring into the schools.
Would you say more about what you are doing in the schools? I think that's fascinating, that you're actually going K through 12. Kindergarten.
Yep, starting in
Sexual
kindergarten.
education in kindergarten.
So,
I think that's great.
Yes, it is. But in kindergarten, we're working with precursor ideas. Tarana Burke's idea about needing empathy, right? That is a key lesson that kids need to learn. If we're going to be we look at what are we going to be talking around specifically, like in the older grades, 6th grade sexual harassment and sexting, 7th, 8th grade, much more around sexual assault, perpetrator behavior. Those things all need to have precursor ideas that we need to instill in kids. And number one is talking just about boundaries, body autonomy, teaching kids that they have a right to say what happens to their bodies. And it's a really fascinating, when you start looking at that, we look at our society and see how often children are at the mercy of adults telling them what to do with their bodies.
Oh, I know.
And a simple example I think that parents often don't really think about is when somebody comes to visit, maybe it's a relative, and we tell the kid, go give so-and-so a hug or a kiss. And if the kid is reluctant, we override that. We don't let them say, oftentimes, I'm not comfortable doing that. And so just some of these things, we need to rethink how we're telling our kids that their bodies don't belong to them.
So it sounds like the adults also need to be educated.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of our program is that we do parent nights every year where we invite parents to come and hear about what we're teaching their kids, why. And then we also want to engage with the parents in a conversation about how can they take those lessons and complete them or continue them at home. Because we really are looking at culture change. We want everybody slowly to understand personal boundaries. We teach kids how to say no. And we also we talk to them about how to accept a no, right? What are those feelings when somebody says no to you? And in the early grades, we're not talking about sexual activity. We're talking about playing with somebody or maybe giving them a hug. Little kids love to hug each other, right? And so instilling that idea that you ask somebody first, may I hug you, right?
Nice.
And then what if your other 6-year-old says no? You know, how do you deal with the feelings that brings up? This is social emotional learning, and it's something that teachers do already in these grades. But what we're doing is we're tying it to creating certain discussion points and ideas. We talk a lot about secrets with little kids.
Oh.
The difference
Why
between
would you talk about secrets?
Well, if you think about perpetrators of child sex abuse, it's usually somebody that the child knows, usually somebody that they trust and love, whether that's a family friend, somebody within the family. And so a common theme for offenders is they tell their victims, don't tell anybody. This is just our secret, right? So there's that, and getting children to understand safe secrets and unsafe secrets, and what are the secrets that need to be told. We're also teaching kids that if their friend tells them a secret that feels bad, you know, their friend might say, this happened, don't tell anyone, right? And we need kids to be able to understand what are the secrets that should be kept from adults, like maybe I have a crush on so-and-so, don't tell anybody, versus this happened to me, don't tell anybody. That secret needs to be told to a safe adult.
So you actually teach young children, when they hear that and they feel uncomfortable with it, to
we talk a
go
lot
to their parents and tell them.
Yeah, or identifying safe adults in their lives, because unfortunately, the parent might not be the safe person, right? So working at a very young age, who are these safe adults in your life that are meant to take care of you? What is that uh-oh feeling? And a lot of these lessons, there are books that have been written to help us bring these lessons forward.
So are you teaching teachers to do this?
In some cases.
Like at SOU, in the education classes?
So there, they have a phenomenal peer educator program. I think Women's Resource Center really started it. Raya, teaches, and they have peer educators who go into classes in the college level, and they're really talking about, very specifically about sexual assault, a lot about consent, right? Part of this culture change is getting people to understand exactly what is this thing called consent and how do you practice it. And we need to build a culture where consent is the norm. And it's really fascinating when you start looking at the culture. For example, if you look at romantic comedies and what is considered romantic and sexy, oftentimes it's a guy pursuing a girl who originally does not want to get involved, and then it's just about, well, if he pursues her hard enough, eventually she'll say yes instead of no. Well, that is the complete opposite of consent, right?
So if you're trying to make a cultural change by going into the schools and identifying ways in which these young children and older children need to respect one another and act and behave, but then they go and they see a movie, or they see adults acting different ways. How in the world are you going to make a cultural change when it's so predominant?
Well, that's why we start early. So if I have my kindergartner, and if for kindergarten through 8th grade, every year there is some version of this reinforcement of body autonomy. You have the right to say yes or no. You don't force things on other people. You need to have clear communication. The level of dialogue that we're having in the upper grades, now that they've had these conversations for so many years, it's phenomenal. And the kids now are identifying this. I can say the word, rape culture, which is all of these social norms that kind of promote gender violence in our society or minimize it. And they understand that, and we have fascinating conversations about what they're seeing in their culture, whether it's TV ads, these romantic comedies, things like that. They are identifying these harmful messages. And we say to them, you folks are the ones who are going to solve this. You're going to be the change. Because now you can see what's happening, and you can see what needs to be changed in your culture, in your environment.
Right. Now,
I was just going to say, we're getting a lot of student activism around that. We're getting folks who want to help educate other people.
Wow.
Ashland High School has this phenomenal group of students, the Got Consent campaign that they started, where they're educating each other. You brought up the SOU students who want to go out and do this work and educate their peers. Way better for peers to be educating peers than somebody, you know, in their 50s who's like
that's not
telling them what to do, right? And that is
work.
the goal, is empower them to change their own culture.
Okay, so what about sports teams? What I used to hear, still do somewhat, is that what happens in the locker room and the kind of jokes and the kind of ways in which they talk about women or girls is really just gives an example of how our culture is just so demeaning of women. How does that begin to change?
You educate
you just have
people.
to educate them.
Yeah, and part of it is making sure that folks understand that what might seem innocuous, a dumb joke, right? So all of these things that people just say, oh, come on, I was just kidding, it's just a joke.
I know.
And yet it really all built up together. It promotes gender violence in a lot of ways, these things. And so we are teaching kids how scary and difficult it can be to call somebody out when they see something that they feel is inappropriate, but how powerful it can be. And we're teaching them to create allies amongst each other so that maybe 3 people can say something instead of just one. And just that comments like that are not innocuous and taken with all of the other things in our society. They cause us harm, and we need to remove them. You know, it needs to stop.
So is this happening nationally or just in the Valley?
Yeah,
it's happening nationally.
Yeah, at various levels, and every community is going to be different, and every group of students. You know, the education starting in kindergarten, that's, even though it's been a mandate in Oregon and for many other states for quite some time, that's really only just starting to take off. There's a fabulous organization called Stop Sexual Assault in Schools. It's a nonprofit, national reach, and they're doing a huge amount of wonderful work of looking at the level of harassment that's going on in our schools, sexual harassment and sexual assault, and really bringing it to light, and then providing resources for parents and students who are experiencing it. And a lot of what they're focusing on is Title IX laws.
Oh, that's what I wanted to
yeah,
get to.
that tell schools that they must respond and they must help. But there hasn't been a lot of guidance, really, and a lot of support for schools to do that. And now, you know, we saw the Title IX thing really come up in colleges over the last few years. There was a great documentary called The Hunting Ground that looked at, you know, and now they're really trying to educate schools that this is a K through 12 issue as well. And so Stop Sexual Assault in Schools and the National Women's Law Center, they came together and they created their own hashtag, hashtag #MeTooK12. And they're having just recently, and they're having a very similar outpouring. And you can imagine, these are kids, these are school-aged kids, showing adults the level of harassment and lack of safety they feel at their schools.
Does this include bullying?
Well, so
or is that completely different?
Bullying, so sexual harassment is a form of bullying.
Okay.
Title IX does not cover bullying per se.
Okay.
It covers specifically gender-based violence. So that might be harassment based on gender identity or your gender or sexual assault, things like that. But you know, but the impulse of bullying is a similar one to sexual harassment, right?
So how is Title IX working now under the new Trump administration?
Well, so Title IX is a law that basically, the piece that we're referring to around the sexual violence, it basically says that a student has a right to access an education free from fear. I'll just say that they have a right to that education, and if there are things like fear of harassment or fear because they've been assaulted by somebody on campus or a teacher or something like that, that has to be mitigated by the school. They have a right to that education, and if there's something that's preventing them from getting it, such as this, you know, fear or an assault, that the school has to do something about that. They have to address that. So that's
By
the
law.
law. And
Okay.
then there were guidelines put in place called the Dear Colleague Letter that sort of told schools this is the best practice and how to implement this law. So recently, Betsy DeVos is, and not just her, but that whole her whole department rescinded those original guidelines and came up with their own that made some changes. The important thing to know is that the new guidelines, it's not a requirement. So schools that were operating and created policies and procedures around under the old guidelines are still free to do those.
They can still do those.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's
absolutely.
important.
And so there is no reason they are not required to lessen their response. And in fact, Oregon and California in particular, the higher ed has sort of banded together and said, we're going to stick with these programs.
Oh, good.
You know, SOU has nationally one of the best Title IX responses called Campus Choice.
Okay, that's great to hear. Just last question.
Yeah.
How can an ordinary citizen who has not experienced or know anyone who's had sexual assault, how can we be involved?
Educate yourself. Number one, know what the resources in your community are. You can find them from our website, you know, because the thing is that you do know somebody who's experienced this. They might not have told you yet, right?
Okay.
And
Good point.
Yeah,
Good point.
and what I tell the kids that we work with is if somebody discloses to you, that means that they feel you're a safe person. You can simply say, I'm really sorry that happened to you. Right? You don't need to get into what, when,
Don't
how.
ask them details or
things
anything
like that. It's just, I'm really sorry that happened to you. How can I help? And then know how to help. Right? Know the resources that you can offer. Be that person who will just be there and listen and not judge. Survivors need to be able to tell their story.
Okay, telling the story is really important. Okay, well, thank you so much. You've really educated me, Susan.
We went down a lot of rabbit holes,
I
didn't we?
Sorry,
great.
I really enjoy listening to you, and not that I enjoy the topic, but you really are informative, and I hope people will begin to educate themselves more about this. So I just want to thank you so much.
Yeah.
We unfortunately have run out of time for part 2 of our program, #MeToo. I want to again thank Susan for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I want to thank our all volunteer crew, especially our producer, Wanda, Borland and Lynn, John, Norman, Joe, David, and Bob. Thank you so much. We're all volunteer crew here, and you've done a great job. Thank you so much. Also want to thank the Digital Media Center and SOU for hosting us. And you can watch our show when it's available on RVTV, I think. There it is. You can see it on the at 3:30 on Saturday. And 6:30 on Thursday. No, 6:30 on Saturday.
You said 6:30 Thursday.
Okay, 6:30
Look it up,
Thursday.
find it.
And 3:30 on Saturday. So you can always get it in the archives and watch our programs there. So I want to thank you all for watching our show. And Girl Talk can also be heard at noon on Sundays on KSKQ Community Radio at 98.5 FM in Ashland and 94.1 FM in Medford. We hope that you will join us again in a couple weeks. And until then, thank you for watching.